Welcome back to the Historical Raven channel. My name is Raven and my pronouns are they, them. This is pop culture, nerdom, and history, where we dive into the intersectionality of fiction and history. Before I begin, I want to put out a content warning. We will be discussing war, the after effects of war, and civilian casualties, both from battle and the use of weapons of mass destruction. Also, there will be spoilers for the 2015 novel Bloodline and 2017 novel Aftermath: Empire's End. If you haven't read either novel, I can't recommend them highly enough. In 2015, we watched the destruction of the New Republic and its entire fleet by a new Death Star. But how could this have happened, and how could a single attack by a force we know very little about destroy a fleet that is meant to protect the galaxy at large? For that, we need to know a little bit of early US history. But first, let's see how we got to a fleet that stood still in the Hosnian system. 5 ABY Jakku system. The Imperial Remnant amasses its remaining forces on and around the desert planet. Despite being a mere fraction of what the Imperial fleet and army was, there are still hundreds of Star Destroyers and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of stormtroopers garrisoned here. The planet, which Jedi Master Luke Skywalker will agree is nowhere decades later, seems unimportant on the surface, but it has been important to the Emperor for decades, and not just for the factories. Gallus Rax plans one last battle to defeat the New Republic and end their tyranny. The New Republic defense fleet comes out of hyperspace and begins its attack. Outnumbering the Imperial Remnant, the New Republic forces number between 9 and 12 million strong, and even this isn't the full force of the New Republic. At least one fleet, led by General Tybin, is being held back on Chandrila, the temporary seat of the fledgling government. Those forces not engaged on Jakku or held back on Chandrila are on alert and waiting for news of what will become the final battle of the Galactic Civil War. This will be the single largest engagement in the Galactic Civil War and will see the Empire finally fall. Despite the looming threat of the Imperial Remnant, Mon Mothma has spent months prior to this battle looking towards the future and working towards reducing the size of the military. This effort culminated months later when the New Republic signed the Military Disarmament Act. This act reduced the military capacity and total numbers of both ships and service members. It also mandated the disarmament of the imperial military that was outlined in the Galactic Concordance that was signed at the conclusion of the Battle of Jakku. Due to this act, the production of new capital ships would drastically be reduced, though starfighters, like the new T-85 X-Wing, would continue to be designed and produced. For 29 years, the New Republic would continue reducing the strength of its military to a peacekeeping force that would assist planetary defense forces, while the government focused on governing the galaxy. After years of infighting, the government split into two unofficial groups, the centrists and the populace. The centrists advocated for a stronger military and a more powerful galactic government, worried that any remaining forces loyal to Palpatine might show up. The populace believed in giving the majority of power to the individual planetary systems. Due to their differences of governmental philosophy, the New Republic legislative body became gridlocked, and the hard-won peace it had earned in 5 ABY would grow uneasy as the successor to the Empire, the First Order, grew in power and began annexing star system after star system. Instead of acting against these First Order incursions, Chancellor Laniver Vilsham remained steadfast on his policy of non-aggression as he forged trade relationships between the New Republic and neutral systems in the Trans-Hydian borderlands. Other senators, like the centrist Lady Carice Zindian and the centrist Erudo Vro Kentor, worked as agents of the First Order to undermine the New Republic. In 28 ABY, Lady Zindian proposed legislation that would abolish the mostly ceremonial position of chancellorship and create the position of First Senator, which would have more power over the military and the economy. This effort only ended after a senator, the populist Tylin Gar of Gatalinta, was assassinated. Princess Leia, now Senator Organa, would leave the Senate in the same year and form the resistance. She would receive intelligence secretly from members of the Senate who supported her effort. Due to the Military Disarmament Act, the New Republic military stood possibly as low as 1 million members across the fleet, army, and special forces. The forces that hadn't jumped ship and joined Leia's resistance would be posted in the Hosnian system, which had been chosen as the new temporary capital of the New Republic and destroyed in 34 ABY by the First Order's Starkiller base. August 1777, New York. The American War for Independence has been raging for more than 2 years with no end in sight. The Saratoga campaign had started 2 months prior with the British advance from Montreal and St. John's, Canada. General John Burgoyne traveled straight south down Lake Champlain, while General Barrymore Sillinger traveled the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario and marched east from Fort Oswego. Generals Benedict Arnold, not yet a traitor, Horatio Gates, and John Stark had moved to meet the British and had engaged them in multiple battles already. General Arnold is currently in the middle of marching his troops up the Mohawk River to help the besieged Fort Schuyler. 200 miles to the east, General John Stark is fighting the British in the Battle of Bennington, Vermont, and just north of Albany sits General Horatio Gates, waiting for Burgoyne's forces, which he will meet at Freeman's Farm on September 19th. The 3 generals and others have been receiving more and more volunteers for about a month after the killing of Jane McCrae, a loyalist woman who was killed while in the custody of British-aligned indigenous forces during an American ambush. Despite her being a loyalist, her death and the story around it will swell American forces in New York to between 20 and 25,000 by the end of October. 300 miles south, General John Howe marches to Philadelphia and prepares to lay siege to the capital city. The British and American troops would fight over the city for a year, with major battles taking place in September and October of 1777. General George Washington would have 14,600 men at Brandywine and 11,000 at Germantown. October 1777 would see the Continental Army at its peak strength of between 34 and 37,000 soldiers. After this point, Continental Army numbers would never get more than 15,000 or so. In fact, during the siege of Yorktown, General Washington commanded 5,900 Continentals. From the end of the war in 1783 to the formation of the U.S. Army on June 3, 1784, small units of Continentals would be stationed at West Point and other outposts. At West Point, all but 500 infantry and 100 artillerymen were released from duty, forming the 1st American Regiment, or Jackson's Continental Regiment. This unit would stand guard until June 2, 1784, when Congress decreed, quote, that the commanding officer be directed to discharge the several officers and soldiers now in the service of the United States, except 25 privates to guard the stores at Fort Pitt and 55 to guard the stores at West Point and other magazines, with a proportionate number of officers. No officer to remain in service above the rank of a captain. Those privates to be retained who are enlisted on the best terms, provided Congress, before its recess, shall not take other measures respecting the disposition of those troops." End quote. A day later, the Continental Army was officially disbanded, and the U.S. would be without a standing army, preferring to allow state militias to do the job of protecting their borders. 1 year later, Congress proclaimed, quote, "Resolved, that the Secretary at War take order for forming the said troops when assembled into one regiment to consist of 8 companies of infantry and 2 of artillery, arming and equipping them in a soldier-like manner, and that he be authorized to direct their destination and operations, subject to the order of Congress and of the Committee of the States in the recess of Congress." End quote. And with that, the 1st American Regiment, the Old Guard, was created. This is not to be confused with the Continental Army 1st American Regiment. Late October 1790, modern-day Fort Wayne, Indiana. The Old Guard, along with 2,000 militiamen, fight for their lives as they are ambushed by warriors from the Northwestern Confederacy, a Native American confederacy of Cherokee, Iroquois, Lenape, and other nations, which is led by Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, and one more. Days later, the unit fights the Battle of Wabash. In one day, more than 800 U.S. soldiers are captured, killed, or wounded, including 4 commanders, 3 from the Army and 1 from the Kentucky militia. The reaction to this defeat was mixed. However, it did lead to the creation of the Legion of the United States in 1792. This pulled in the Old Guard, which is now the 3rd, and 4th Infantry Regiments under one command. It would last until 1796, and there would be a total of 2,600 men who served under it. Which brings us to the politics of the United States. For more than a year, the newly independent states didn't have a national government. Delegations from the individual states would convene in Philadelphia, but there was no real mandate or real power. On June 11, 1776, a committee was formed to write what would become the Articles of Confederation. These articles would be adopted on November 15, 1777, and would be the Constitution of the United States throughout the rest of the war and for 6 years after. Under the articles, states held all the power. Congress could ask for funding or for soldiers, but the states could ignore the Continental Congress, and often did. On top of this, Congress had no power to create supply systems, systems of distribution, or purchasing systems. These problems plagued the fledgling nation and would lead men like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, and others to push for a stronger central government. These men had watched and become irritated with the inability of the fledgling national government to get things done. A major factor of the U.S. not losing the war for independence was the intervention of the French army, who had brought an army of 10,800 to help in the siege of Yorktown. Eventually, this group of men convinced the Continental Congress to convene in Philadelphia in 1787 under the pretense of revising the Articles of Confederation. This would lead to the creation of the United States Constitution in secret. On the other side of this fight were men like Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, and other prominent men and women. While the men had seen the same issues, they opposed the Constitution as potentially oppressive, stomping over states' rights, and would generally just bring the same issues that they had just fought a war over. The last thing they wanted was another despotic government that ignored the needs of the states. And they feared what an unaccountable federal government would do with a standing army. All of this back and forth fighting would leave the U.S. Army in constant flux and continuously undermanned. If you made it this far, thank you for watching and listening. I hope I was able to connect the dots between Star Wars and the history it took inspiration from. If you'd like more information, my sources are in the description, as are some few extra notes. If you like the content, be it the episode or the race, give me a like. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode and another race. Until then, have a good day. 1798, United States. After going without the Legion for 2 years, Congress would call for a provisional army during the quasi-war with the French. Although this was meant to be comprised of about 10,000 men, only 4,100 had been mobilized by the time it was disbanded in June 1800. When Jefferson took office in 1801, he reduced the size of the U.S. Army to less than 3,300, and it would not grow much larger. In fact, it would go neglected for his full 2 terms, and even under James Madison after 1809, it wouldn't fare much better. Under Madison, it would grow slightly, but by 1812, only 7,000 men would be serving in the army.